When did someone last destroy your confidence in an argument you knew you were right about? When did you walk away from a debate feeling confused, manipulated, even though deep down you knew the truth was on your side? I'm talking about that sinking feeling when someone twists your words, shifts the goalposts, or uses clever rhetoric to make you question your own sanity. You've been there. We all have. But what if I told you there's a way to see through every single manipulation tactic before it even hits you? Meet Felix Hartmann, 29 years old, a brilliant software engineer who thought logic and facts were enough to win any argument. Until 3 months ago, when his entire worldview shattered during a single board meeting. What happened to Felix that day will reveal the most dangerous secret about human argumentation that most people will never discover. In the next minutes, I'll reveal Arthur Schopenhauer's most dangerous discovery about strategic argumentation and intellectual self-defense. This 19th century German philosopher cracked the code on how people manipulate, deceive, and control others through seemingly innocent conversations. His 38 stratagems for winning arguments aren't just academic theories. They're psychological weapons that shape your reality every single day. You see, Schopenhauer understood something terrifying. Truth has nothing to do with who wins an argument. The person who wins is simply the one who knows the game being played. And right now, you don't even know you're playing. What I'm about to show you will forever change how you see the hidden psychological warfare happening in every conversation, every negotiation, every moment someone tries to influence your thoughts. Stay until the end, because I'll reveal Schopenhauer's most ruthless stratagem, the one that can instantly expose any manipulator's true intentions. By the end of this video, you'll know exactly how to anticipate, counter, and outmaneuver any opposing idea before it can take root in your mind. You'll have the intellectual self-defense system that Felix wished he'd known that day in the boardroom. But here's where it gets dangerous. Felix Hartmann had always believed in the power of truth. As a senior software engineer at a Fortune 500 company, he lived in a world of logical systems, clean code, and provable outcomes. If something worked, you could demonstrate it. If it didn't, the errors were obvious. Reality was binary, true or false, functional or broken. That confidence served him well until the morning of March 15th, when he walked into the quarterly strategy meeting, armed with 6 months of data, proving that the company's new AI initiative was fundamentally flawed. Felix had run the numbers, analyzed the algorithms, and identified 3 critical security vulnerabilities that could cost the company millions. He had truth on his side. What could go wrong? Arthur Schopenhauer observed that most people believe arguments are won through reason and evidence. In his controversial work, Eristic Dialectic, The Art of Being Right, Schopenhauer wrote, "The aim of an argument or discussion should not be victory, but progress." But then he revealed something darker. However, with most people, this is not the case. Felix discovered this the hard way. The moment he presented his findings, the VP of Technology, Marcus Chen, didn't address a single data point. Instead, Marcus smiled and said, "Felix, I appreciate your thorough analysis, but I'm curious, when did you become an expert on corporate strategy? Your background is in back-end development, correct?" Felix felt the room shift. Suddenly, his 6 months of research felt irrelevant. The focus had moved from his evidence to his credentials. He stammered through a response about data speaking for itself, but Marcus had already moved on to discussing vision and big-picture thinking. What Felix didn't realize was that he'd just experienced Schopenhauer's stratagem number 4, conceal your game. Marcus never intended to debate the technical merits. He was playing an entirely different game, one focused on authority, perception, and social dynamics rather than truth. Schopenhauer understood that most people enter arguments believing they're in a collaborative search for truth. They bring facts, logic, and good intentions. But skilled manipulators know that arguments aren't about discovering what's right. They're about controlling what people believe is right. The false assumption everyone makes is that rational people will naturally arrive at rational conclusions when presented with rational evidence. But Schopenhauer discovered something unsettling. All truth passes through 3 stages. First, it is ridiculed. Second, it is violently opposed. Third, it is accepted as being self-evident. The problem is that most people never make it past stage 1 because they don't understand the psychological mechanisms at work in human communication. They think they're playing chess when their opponent is playing psychological warfare. Felix left that meeting with his data intact, but his confidence shattered. His facts hadn't changed, but somehow his position felt weak, almost embarrassing. He'd been outmaneuvered by someone who never even acknowledged his evidence existed. But here's where it gets dangerous. 3 days after the board meeting, Felix couldn't shake the feeling that he'd been played. He replayed the conversation in his mind, analyzing every word, every gesture, every subtle shift in the room's energy. That's when he stumbled across something that would change everything. A dusty philosophy book in his local bookstore titled The Art of Being Right by Arthur Schopenhauer. What Felix discovered in those pages was disturbing. Schopenhauer hadn't just studied argumentation, he'd dissected it like a surgeon, revealing the psychological anatomy of manipulation. And the most unsettling part? Everything Marcus had done in that meeting was right there, cataloged like a recipe for intellectual domination. Arthur Schopenhauer's most controversial insight was that human beings are fundamentally irrational creatures, pretending to be rational. In Eristic Dialectic, he wrote, "The majority of men are subjective in their view of things. In other words, they cannot forget themselves." This wasn't pessimism. It was clinical observation. Schopenhauer had identified something terrifying about human nature. We don't actually want truth. We want to be right. And there's a massive difference between these two desires that most people never recognize. Felix began to see Marcus's tactics with horrifying clarity. When Marcus questioned his expertise, he wasn't attacking Felix's argument. He was attacking Felix's right to have an argument. This was Schopenhauer's stratagem number 16, arguments ad hominem. Don't refute the claim, discredit the person making it. But it went deeper. Marcus had used stratagem number 130, appeal to authority instead of argument. By subtly referencing corporate strategy and big picture thinking, Marcus positioned himself as the authority figure whose opinion mattered more than Felix's data. He never had to prove Felix wrong. He just had to establish that Felix wasn't qualified to be right. The psychology behind this is ruthless. Schopenhauer understood that most people are more concerned with social standing than truth. When someone questions your credentials in front of others, your brain activates the same threat response as physical danger. Your rational mind shuts down, and your survival instincts take over. You stop thinking about being right, and start thinking about not being embarrassed. Felix realized he'd been caught in what Schopenhauer called the dialectical trap. He'd entered the conversation believing it was about solving a problem, but Marcus had turned it into a contest about who deserved to speak. And in that contest, data was irrelevant. This is where Schopenhauer's philosophy becomes genuinely disturbing. He documented 38 different stratagems that people use to win arguments without ever addressing the actual subject. These aren't just rhetorical tricks. They're psychological weapons designed to exploit fundamental weaknesses in human cognition. Consider stratagem number 1. Extend your opponent's proposition. Take what someone says and stretch it to an absurd extreme, then attack the extreme version. Marcus had done this perfectly. Felix presented specific technical concerns, but Marcus reframed it as Felix questioning the entire strategic vision of the company. Or stratagem number 14. Pretend to misunderstand. Act as if your opponent's reasonable position is actually something ridiculous, then respond to the ridiculous version. So Felix, you're saying we should abandon innovation altogether? Felix felt sick as he read through Schopenhauer's list. Every political debate, every family argument, every workplace disagreement he'd ever witnessed suddenly made sense. People weren't confused or irrational. They were following an unconscious script for psychological dominance. The most chilling realization was that Marcus probably didn't even know he was doing it. These patterns are so deeply embedded in human social behavior that we execute them automatically. Schopenhauer wrote, "All satisfaction, or what is commonly called happiness, is really and essentially always negative only, and never positive." What he meant was that people don't argue to discover truth. They argue to avoid the pain of being wrong. And when avoiding pain becomes your primary motivation, manipulation becomes inevitable. But here's where it gets dangerous. Felix spent the next week obsessively studying Schopenhauer's stratagems, and what he discovered made him question every conversation he'd ever had. These weren't random tricks. They were components of a sophisticated psychological machine that operates in every human interaction. And once you see the machine, you can never unsee it. The breakthrough came when Felix realized that Marcus hadn't just used individual tactics. He'd orchestrated an entire sequence designed to achieve a specific psychological outcome. This was systematic manipulation disguised as normal conversation. In eristic dialectic, the art of being right, Schopenhauer explained that successful argumentation follows predictable patterns. If you want to draw a conclusion, you must not let it be foreseen, but you must get the premises admitted one by one, unobserved, mingling them here and there in your talk. Felix mapped out exactly what had happened in that boardroom. Phase 1, the setup. Marcus opened with apparent respect. "Felix, I appreciate your thorough analysis." This wasn't genuine appreciation. It was stratagem number 29. Make the argument into a personal attack. By praising Felix's thoroughness, Marcus was actually setting up the contrast that would make Felix appear obsessive and narrow-minded. Phase 2, the redirect. When did you become an expert on corporate strategy? This was stratagem number 27. If your opponent presses you with a counterproof, you will often be able to save yourself by advancing some subtle distinction. Marcus wasn't distinguishing between technical accuracy and strategic vision. He was creating a false hierarchy where strategy trumps facts. Phase 3, the authority trap. By positioning himself as the strategic thinker and Felix as merely technical, Marcus activated what Schopenhauer called the reverence for rank. People automatically defer to perceived authority, even when that authority is artificially constructed. Phase 4, the social proof. Marcus's casual dismissal signaled to everyone else in the room that Felix's concerns weren't worth serious consideration. This was stratagem number 32. Put your proposition in some category that your opponent dislikes. Felix's data-driven approach was implicitly categorized as not strategic thinking. What terrified Felix was the elegance of it. Each step flowed naturally into the next, creating what felt like a normal business conversation, while systematically dismantling Felix's credibility and position. Schopenhauer understood that this psychological machinery operates below conscious awareness. He wrote, "The discovery of truth is prevented more effectively, not by the false appearance things present, but by preconceived opinion, by prejudice." Marcus hadn't needed to disprove Felix's data because he'd activated the room's preconceived notions about hierarchy, expertise, and what real leadership looked like. Felix began testing his new understanding in smaller interactions. He watched colleagues in meetings, analyzed family dinner conversations, even observed his own responses to news articles and social media posts. The patterns were everywhere. In one particularly revealing moment, Felix watched his coworker Sarah shut down a junior developer's innovative suggestion using Stratagem number 119. Should your opponent propose a plan, you may attack it by seeking to find a general category of plans that are open to objection, and then assign his plan to this category. Sarah had categorized the suggestion as another technical solution looking for a problem, without ever examining its actual merits. The most disturbing realization was that these patterns had shaped Felix's entire worldview. How many good ideas had he dismissed because they came from the wrong person? How many times had he been manipulated into supporting positions that served someone else's interests? Schopenhauer's genius was recognizing that human cognition is fundamentally flawed. We think we're logical, but we're actually running on ancient social programming designed for small tribal groups. In modern complex societies, this programming becomes a vulnerability that skilled manipulators exploit unconsciously. Felix understood now why his data had been irrelevant in that boardroom. He'd brought facts to a psychological warfare contest. He'd tried to win through truth when the game was actually about power, status, and social dynamics. The machine behind the curtain wasn't just individual tactics. It was an entire system of human interaction designed to maintain existing hierarchies and suppress inconvenient truths. And it worked precisely because good people like Felix never realized they were being manipulated. What Felix discovered next would shatter his remaining illusions about human nature. 2 weeks into his Schopenhauer education, Felix made a horrifying discovery. While reviewing his own emails and past conversations, he found something that made his stomach drop. He'd been using these same manipulative tactics his entire career. The victim had also been the perpetrator, and he'd never even noticed. It started with a simple email he'd sent 6 months earlier to a junior developer named Amy. She'd proposed a different approach to database optimization, and Felix had responded, "Amy, I appreciate your creativity, but you might want to focus on mastering the fundamentals before proposing major architectural changes." Reading it now, Felix saw the manipulation clearly. He'd used stratagem number 16, attack the person, not the argument, combined with stratagem number 4, conceal your game by appearing helpful. He'd never addressed Amy's actual proposal. He'd simply positioned himself as the authority figure whose experience trumped her innovation. Arthur Schopenhauer warned that this moment of self-recognition was inevitable for anyone who truly understood eristic dialectic. A man can be himself only so long as he is alone, and if he does not love solitude, he will not love freedom. For it is only when he is alone that he is really free. What Schopenhauer meant was that we only see our true nature when we stop performing for others. And what Felix saw in that mirror of self-reflection was deeply uncomfortable. He'd spent years unconsciously suppressing other people's ideas to maintain his own status and comfort. The psychology behind this is ruthless. Schopenhauer understood that we don't just use these tactics against our enemies. We use them against anyone who threatens our sense of intellectual security. Amy's database proposal wasn't technically wrong. It was just different from how Felix would have approached it. But different felt dangerous to Felix's expertise, so he'd neutralized the threat using the same psychological weapons that Marcus had used against him. Felix began cataloging his own patterns of manipulation, and the list was extensive. The expert shield. Whenever someone challenged his technical decisions, Felix would reference his years of experience rather than addressing their specific points. This was stratagem number 30, appeal to authority, using himself as the authority. The complexity trap. When junior developers proposed simple solutions, Felix would often complicate them unnecessarily, then suggest his more complex version was more robust. This was stratagem number 1, extend the opponent's proposition, in reverse, minimizing their contribution by making it seem simplistic. The false choice. In architecture meetings, Felix regularly presented options as binary choices between his preferred solution and obviously inferior alternatives. This was stratagem number 15. Advance paradoxes. The opponent will be forced to defend what is common and obvious. The most disturbing realization was that Felix had genuinely believed he was being helpful and professional in all these interactions. He'd convinced himself that his superior experience justified dismissing others' ideas. But Schopenhauer revealed the uncomfortable truth. All truth passes through 3 stages. First, it is ridiculed. Second, it is violently opposed. Third, it is accepted as being self-evident. Felix had been operating primarily in stages 1 and 2, systematically ridiculing and opposing new ideas to protect his own intellectual territory. He'd become exactly what he'd accused Marcus of being, a manipulator disguised as a rational professional. This pattern extended beyond work. Felix recognized the same dynamics in his relationship with his girlfriend, Sarah. When she'd suggested they try couples therapy after a particularly difficult period, Felix had responded, "I think we can solve our own problems without paying someone to tell us things we already know." He'd dismissed her suggestion by categorizing therapy as unnecessary, stratagem number 32, while positioning himself as the more rational, self-reliant partner. Schopenhauer's philosophy reveals why this self-deception is so persistent. He wrote, "The greatest of follies is to sacrifice health for any other kind of happiness." But he might as well have written, "The greatest of follies is to sacrifice truth for the comfort of being right." Felix realized he'd been sacrificing truth and relationships for years to maintain his intellectual comfort zone. Every time someone challenged his ideas, his brain treated it as a threat to his identity rather than an opportunity for growth. And his response was always the same: deploy psychological defenses to neutralize the threat. The truly chilling insight was that this pattern was probably universal. How many brilliant ideas had been killed in boardrooms, classrooms, and casual conversations by people like Felix, who unconsciously protected their status by attacking anything unfamiliar. Schopenhauer had identified the core problem with human nature. We're not truth-seeking creatures pretending to be competitive. We're competitive creatures pretending to seek truth. And once that mask slips away, the real psychological battlefield becomes visible. Felix stared at his reflection in his laptop screen, seeing himself clearly for the first time. He wasn't the rational, data-driven professional he'd believed himself to be. He was a skilled manipulator who'd learned to disguise intellectual aggression as expertise and wisdom. The question that would haunt him next was even more terrifying. If everyone was unconsciously playing this game, was genuine communication even possible? Felix spent 3 sleepless nights wrestling with a seemingly impossible question. If manipulation was built into human nature, how could anyone escape it? The answer came from an unexpected source. Schopenhauer himself had provided the antidote to his own poison, but it required a radical shift in how Felix understood the entire game. The breakthrough came when Felix discovered Schopenhauer's most radical insight buried deep in his philosophical writings. While The Art of Being Right cataloged the weapons of intellectual warfare, Schopenhauer's broader philosophy revealed something profound. The only way to win this game was to stop playing it entirely. Arthur Schopenhauer's solution was radical and counterintuitive. He wrote, "A man can do what he wants, but not want what he wants." The key wasn't to become better at manipulation. It was to transcend the psychological need that made manipulation necessary in the first place. Schopenhauer understood that all these argumentative strategies emerged from what he called the will, the unconscious drive for survival, status, and self-preservation that controls human behavior. As long as you're protecting your ego, you'll inevitably manipulate others and be manipulated by them. The only escape was what he termed will-less knowing, a state where your identity wasn't threatened by being wrong. This wasn't just philosophical theory. Felix began experimenting with what he privately called intellectual aikido, using the energy of manipulation against itself. The first principle: detachment from outcome. Instead of entering conversations to win, Felix started entering them to understand. When Marcus used stratagem number 16, attack the person, in their next meeting, Felix responded, "You're right that my background is primarily technical. Help me understand how these technical concerns fit into the broader strategic picture." The result was remarkable. Marcus, prepared for defensive pushback, suddenly found himself in a collaborative conversation instead of a competitive one. Felix had refused to play the status game, which meant Marcus's manipulation tactics had nothing to grab onto. The second principle: transparent acknowledgement. When Felix recognized someone using a Schopenhauer stratagem, instead of counterattacking, he would acknowledge it directly, but without aggression. In one memorable moment, a colleague used stratagem number 1, extend the proposition to absurdity, and Felix responded, "I think you're pushing my position further than I intended. Let me clarify what I'm actually suggesting." This created what Felix called conversational jujitsu. By naming the manipulation without attacking the manipulator, he shifted the entire dynamic from combat back to communication. The third principle: genuine curiosity about opposition. Schopenhauer wrote, "Every man takes the limits of his own field of vision for the limits of the world." Felix realized that people who disagreed with him weren't enemies. They were people with different limits of vision. Their opposition contained information he needed. When Amy, the junior developer he'd previously dismissed, proposed another innovative solution, Felix tried something revolutionary. Instead of looking for ways to critique it, he asked, "What am I not seeing that makes this approach attractive to you?" Amy's explanation revealed blind spots in Felix's thinking that his experience had actually created, not eliminated. The fourth principle: strategic vulnerability. This was perhaps the most counterintuitive discovery. Schopenhauer's stratagems worked by exploiting people's need to appear invulnerable and right. But what if you willingly acknowledged uncertainty and mistakes? In his next presentation to the board, Felix opened with, "3 months ago, I presented concerns about our AI initiative that were technically accurate but strategically incomplete. I'd like to share what I've learned since then that changes how I think about this project." The room's energy shifted immediately. Marcus, prepared for another confrontation, found himself in a different kind of conversation entirely. By voluntarily acknowledging his limitations, Felix had made himself unattackable through traditional manipulation tactics. The fifth principle, the meta-conversation. Sometimes Felix would explicitly acknowledge the psychological dynamics at play. "I notice we're starting to argue about who's more qualified rather than which approach might work better. Could we refocus on the actual problem we're trying to solve?" This level of meta-awareness often shocked people into recognizing their own behavior patterns. It was like pointing out that everyone was playing poker while pretending to have a philosophical discussion about cards. Schopenhauer had understood something profound. The person who transcends the need to win arguments becomes nearly impossible to defeat in them. Not because they're more skilled at manipulation, but because they're playing an entirely different game, one focused on understanding rather than domination. Felix discovered that this approach didn't just make him more effective in professional settings, it transformed his relationships entirely. Conversations with Sarah became explorations rather than competitions. Interactions with colleagues became collaborative rather than territorial. But the most profound change was internal. Felix no longer felt the constant anxiety of defending his intellectual territory. He could afford to be wrong because his identity wasn't dependent on being right about everything. The terrifying power of this approach would soon be put to its ultimate test. 3 months after discovering Schopenhauer's secrets, Felix faced his greatest challenge yet. The company's AI initiative had failed spectacularly, exactly as his data had predicted. Security breaches, cost overruns, and client defections had cost the company $12 million. The board was convening an emergency meeting to determine what went wrong and who was responsible. Felix knew this would be Marcus's most dangerous hour. Cornered and facing potential career destruction, Marcus would deploy every psychological weapon in his arsenal. This wasn't just another meeting. It was intellectual warfare with real consequences. As Felix walked into that boardroom, he carried with him everything Schopenhauer had taught him about the true nature of human conflict. The German philosopher had written, "Intellect is invisible to the man who has none." Today, Felix would discover whether intellectual invisibility could become his greatest strength. Marcus opened with a masterpiece of strategic manipulation. "I want to thank Felix for his persistence in raising concerns about our AI initiative. While his technical predictions proved accurate, I think we all learned something important about the difference between being right about details and being right about direction." It was brilliant. Marcus had used stratagem number 11. Make your opponent's point seem unimportant by categorizing it narrowly. He'd acknowledged Felix's correctness while simultaneously diminishing its significance. Technical accuracy was being positioned as less valuable than strategic vision, even though the strategic vision had failed catastrophically. The old Felix would have attacked immediately, pointing out the logical contradictions and demanding accountability. But Schopenhauer had taught him something more powerful. The person who gets angry first loses the argument. Instead, Felix responded with what he'd learned to call philosophical Aikido. "Marcus, you're absolutely right that there's a difference between technical accuracy and strategic direction. I'm genuinely curious. How do you think we can better integrate technical insights into strategic planning going forward? What would that collaboration look like?" The room fell silent. Felix had refused to take the bait. Instead of defending his position, he'd redirected the conversation toward problem solving. Marcus, prepared for combat, found himself being asked to engage in genuine strategic thinking. But Marcus wasn't finished. He deployed stratagem number 37. Should your opponent surprise you by becoming particularly angry at an argument, you must urge it with more zeal. Except Felix wasn't angry. He was curious. So Marcus tried a different approach. Felix, I admire your technical skills, but I think you're missing the bigger picture. Sometimes leaders have to make difficult decisions with incomplete information. That's what separates management from individual contributors. This was a sophisticated combination of stratagems number 16, attack the person, and number 19, assigned to a category that's open to objection. Marcus was positioning Felix as someone who didn't understand leadership complexity. Felix felt the familiar surge of defensive anger, but Schopenhauer's wisdom held him steady. He'd learned that anger was just his ego trying to protect itself from perceived threats. Instead of fighting the manipulation, he acknowledged it directly. You're pointing out that I'm approaching this from an individual contributor perspective rather than a management perspective. That's a fair observation. From your management experience, what could I have done differently to make my concerns more actionable at the strategic level? The energy in the room shifted dramatically. Other board members began asking genuine questions about process improvement rather than assigning blame. Felix had transformed a witch hunt into a learning opportunity by refusing to participate in the psychological warfare. Arthur Schopenhauer believed that those who transcended the need for intellectual dominance gained access to something far more powerful. The truth can wait, for it lives a long life. Felix discovered that when you stop trying to prove you're right and start trying to understand what's actually happening, people begin to trust your judgment in ways that feel almost supernatural. By the end of that meeting, the board had implemented 3 new protocols for integrating technical and strategic perspectives. Marcus kept his position, but his authority was now balanced by genuine collaborative processes. Felix had won something far more valuable than a single argument. He'd helped create a system where truth had a better chance of emerging. The final validation came 2 weeks later when Amy approached Felix with another innovative proposal. This time, instead of dismissing or competing with her ideas, Felix asked questions that helped her refine and strengthen her approach. Her final solution was better than anything Felix could have developed alone. Felix realized this was Schopenhauer's ultimate insight. The highest form of intellectual power isn't the ability to defeat others. It's the ability to help truth emerge through collaboration rather than combat. When you stop trying to be the smartest person in the room, you often end up making the room itself smarter. Schopenhauer had provided something more valuable than manipulation tactics. He'd revealed the psychological freedom that comes from transcending the need to manipulate it all. Felix had learned to see through every strategy in the art of being right, by mastering the art of being genuinely curious instead. 6 months after that final board meeting, Felix Hartmann is a different person entirely. He still works as a senior software engineer, but his colleagues now seek him out, not because he has all the answers, but because he asks the questions that lead to breakthrough solutions. His relationship with Sarah has deepened into something neither of them thought possible. Genuine partnership built on curiosity rather than competition. But the most profound change is invisible. Felix no longer experiences that constant background anxiety of having to defend his intellectual territory. He's discovered what Schopenhauer called the peace that surpasses understanding, the psychological freedom that comes from transcending the need to be right about everything. Now you have the same dangerous knowledge that transformed Felix's life. You've seen behind the curtain of human interaction. You understand the 38 stratagems that people use unconsciously to manipulate, control, and dominate others. More importantly, you've learned Schopenhauer's ultimate secret. The person who stops playing the manipulation game becomes virtually immune to being manipulated. This isn't just intellectual theory, it's practical power. The next time someone tries to dismiss your ideas by attacking your credentials, you'll recognize stratagem number 16 and respond with curiosity instead of defensiveness. When someone extends your argument to an absurd extreme, you'll see stratagem number 1 and gently redirect back to your actual position. When someone appeals to false authority or creates false choices, you'll remain centered in what Schopenhauer called will-less knowing. But here's what makes this knowledge truly dangerous. Most people will never learn these patterns. They'll spend their entire lives being unconsciously manipulated and consciously manipulating others, trapped in cycles of intellectual combat that prevent genuine truth from emerging. You now have a choice. You can use Schopenhauer's stratagems as weapons to dominate others, or you can use his deeper wisdom to transcend the battlefield entirely. You can join the invisible minority who understand how human psychology actually works, or you can return to the comfortable illusion that rational people naturally arrive at rational conclusions. The philosopher who revealed humanity's darkest intellectual impulses also showed us the path to freedom from them. Arthur Schopenhauer's greatest gift wasn't teaching us how to win arguments. It was showing us how to have conversations so genuine that winning becomes irrelevant. Felix discovered that truth really does have a long life. It can wait, but it can't emerge in environments where everyone is fighting to be right instead of working to understand. The question now is, what will you do with this dangerous knowledge? If this video has opened your eyes to the psychological machinery operating in your own life, hit that subscribe button and the notification bell. Every week, I reveal the hidden psychological insights from history's greatest thinkers that can transform how you understand yourself and others. And if you're ready to go deeper into Schopenhauer's philosophy and discover the other mental frameworks that most people never learn, check out the next video where I reveal his most shocking insight about human desire and why getting what you want might be the worst thing that could happen to you. The conversation is just beginning.